Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Thursday, August 11th. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Notre Dame game is in 23 days, the game against Michigan in 107 days. A few housekeeping notes before we get into today's show. First of all, if you're listening to this as a podcast, please make sure you are also subscribed to our new YouTube channel. That is not the same one that it was a week ago, so you may have to subscribe to a new one. We are very sorry about that. There were some technical issues that meant we had to start a new one from scratch. We're not thrilled about it either, but we're pretty sure this is going to be the last time. So go ahead and you can find the correct link on Twitter. Just search my timeline, Tony Gerderman, any of the other guys from the site. You should be able to find it. We will also have the link on the message board at BuckeyeHuddle.com. And Kevin Noon, one of those guys who is a part of BuckeyeHuddle.com. He is officially part of the site as well. That's pretty fantastic. Kevin and Tony and I did a live episode of Buckeye Weekly on Wednesday afternoon. That was a lot of fun to have Kevin back on the team. We're expecting to launch the full site very soon. We will let you know when that happens here and on YouTube and, of course, at BuckeyeHuddle.com. All right, done with the housekeeping, on to the show. My guest today is another person who I'm thrilled to be working with again at Buckeye Huddle. He is our X's and O's guru, Ross Fulton. Ross, thanks for being here.
Happy to, as always, Tom.
So we have talked a whole bunch about Jim Knowles this year, and I feel like maybe we need to kind of circle back and touch on a couple things we've talked about earlier because we've got some new viewers, new listeners, and it's been a long time since we talked about some of the stuff back in January, and Jim Knowles has been a very hot topic of conversation. I think people have a sense that he's expected to improve the Ohio State defense, but I wanted to look today at why that's something that could happen. Let's start with the 4-2-5 defense. That is, when we say 4-2-5, that's 4 defensive linemen, 2 linebackers, 5 defensive backs is sort of their base look. It is a look that we've sort of seen from the Buckeyes a decent amount before, but why is that becoming a bigger and bigger part of defense, both at Ohio State and nationally in recent years?
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that it's not becoming. It has been. I think Ohio State has been decidedly behind the times the last 3 years. The short answer is because your base set in college football is 11 personnel with 3 wide receivers, a tight end, and a running back. And so you want to try to match personnel as best you can on defense. And so a lot of the things we've talked about before, you create explosive plays out of the passing game. So that the first goal in modern football has to be to cover ground and on defense, and then and we can get into this, but that's Bill's first goal, and then he works backwards from there to plug gaps in the run game.
You talked about covering ground there. Let's talk about not covering ground, but covering grass. That's something that we've talked about before, and it's something that we heard a lot about last fall when things were not going great for them on defense. What does it mean to be guarding grass? It's not a good thing. So what is that? And then what does Knowles do that will make that something we see less of this season?
Yeah, guarding grass, it's a pejorative for the concept of spot dropping in zones, which is the traditional way that zone coverage has worked in football. You basically, in your base, let's say cover 3, you have 3 deep defenders and 4 underneath defenders. So you divide the field up into 3 deep zones and 4 underneath zones, and each person who's responsible for that zone sort of drops to the middle of it, and you play eyes on the quarterback and you break on the ball. That has decidedly gone out of vogue, particularly at the college level, where you see much more of modern concepts like, you can spend a lot of time to get into the weeds of these, but man matching, which is the concept of, this is what Nick Saban and his Sabanites do a lot of, where you're basically guarding a man and then you trade off that man depending on your rules. You can pattern match, which is where you're playing that same zone coverage, but if someone comes into your zone, you're covering them in man. I mean, the problem with spot dropping is that you can tend to sit there, and if the quarterback has enough time, there are holes, and it's hard to break on the ball in time. And if you're not good at it, it gets worse. And so Ohio State had quite a bit of problems with their spot dropping last year, both just in terms of execution. Now, I will say Knowles will do some spot dropping, and people maybe overestimate the extent that spot dropping's dead. I mean, you still see it in the NFL. You see it. It depends on the coverage, though. It's not the only type. So he will man match, particularly when he's using a cover 4 concept. And we've talked about that before. But he will do some spot dropping, like when you're zone blitzing, and or like some cover 3 concepts. But it will be far less of it, and it's far less predictable when the defense is going to do it.
One thing that I think we've talked about, and I think people have heard a lot about over the last few years under Ryan Day, is the one high look. That, it's something that he really wanted, and he talked about when he took over as a head coach, because it was something that gave him trouble when he was an offensive assistant. Can you explain, the one high look and what that means, why maybe it created some issues for them last year, and then what might be different for them on defense this year?
Yeah, so I mean, when people say you're playing one high, it just means you're using one of 2 coverages where you have a single middle of the field safety, cover 1 and cover 3, instead of 2 high concepts are where you have 2 split safeties, cover 2 and cover 4 and variations. And so, but I think what Ryan Day really meant is like the Pete Carroll like defense that the Legion of Boom made very famous and did take over the NFL when Ryan Day was in the NFL with Chip Kelly and became popular. The problem is that like everything else in football, eventually like people have time and they figure out how to defeat it. And so, you even see now Pete Carroll is not nearly as dependent on single high looks as he used to be. And most of his people in the NFL are not either. And similarly, it's just predictable. You're running 2 coverages. Obviously, you can toggle between man and zone, but if the quarterback knows that he's going to have a single field middle safety, it makes things a lot easier on him than, Ohio State, we talked about after the spring game, like Jim Knowles used probably 4 times as many coverages in the spring game as Ohio State used in 3 years combined.
What kind of changes are you expecting? I mean, obviously there's a lot more diversity there, but what kinds of different looks are you maybe going to see this year, and what do those different looks potentially accomplish other than making you less predictable?
Yeah, I mean, my snarky answer is a defense that looks like the rest of modern college football. My second response is like how much time you have. I mean, so I think so. It's kind of it depends how you define things, right? So like Ronnie Hickman at Big Ten Media Days was like, well, this defense is simpler, and kind of like, well, what do you mean by that? But Knowles had a comment in the spring where he's like, I'm going to put up on myself to call the right defense, and like within each defense, I'm going to give my players very simple, like straightforward assignments. So that contrasts with, you could run a defense where you don't have a lot of scheme, but the players have to adjust within it. So Knowles carries a lot of defense, and by that I mean like a lot of different types of things. I mean, we've talked about a lot of them. Like, yes, there's a base 4-2-5. There's cover 1, cover 2, cover 3, variations of cover 4. He'll play cover 0. He'll sim pressure. He'll creeper. He'll zone blitz. He'll do the 3 down front where he moves, the Leo around and mugs him up over the guard. Lots of things. Each one, so he puts a lot on himself to be game plan specific to the opponent, and to think that he's going to be a step ahead of the offensive coordinator that he's going against. And so then within each of those concepts, it's a straightforward assignment. Maybe with the exception of like the deep safeties, they might have to react a couple of different ways depending on how things are going, which I do think his other moniker, that's a safety-driven defense, I agree with that assessment. But you will just see infinitely more kinds of defensive plays called than Ohio State's used the past 3 years.
One thing you've seen from Ohio State the past 3 years, and probably the 3 years before that, and maybe the 3 years before that, is 4-down linemen. They are traditional 4-down linemen. That is what Larry Johnson does. That is what Larry Johnson has always done. You just mentioned the Leo. I'm contractually obligated to ask about the Leo now. The Leo / the Jack. That guy who maybe is, the defensive end who's maybe not just playing with his hand in the dirt in one very predictable spot. You talked about him mugging up behind the guard. Explain what does mugging do? What is mugging, and what does mugging accomplish? What are you hoping to do when you're moving that guy around?
Yeah, I mean, there's entirely too much focus on this concept, and I do think that Knowles will probably use it less this year for several reasons than he did last year at Oklahoma State. But that said, like, it is not a concept where you are moving the guy around to create a pass rush. It's instead generally used as a run stopping strategy. So again, we work with the premise that like Knowles wants to run a 4-2-5, and he wants to at least give the appearance that he's got 2 deep safeties pre-snap. So now you're down gaps in the run game, so you have to make them up. And, one way he does that, depending, again, like, it's very opponent-specific. So, like, we talked about mugging up the guard. He did that a lot against Oklahoma last year because Oklahoma likes to run a lot of counter tray where they're going to down block and pull the backside guards. And so when you're covering up the guard, it makes it much harder to get those, like, down blocks and to pull when that guy's just sitting right there over the guard. So, like, that's an example of, or, he'll sack him so the offensive line doesn't know which guy is responsible for which gap. So a lot of times, like, he's still using the same basic, like, 4 down front principles, like everyone has a gap, but he's working at ways to confuse the offense who has what gap and, like, how to steal gaps.
Well, one other change that we've talked about before that I don't think we've touched on yet today is the linebackers. Obviously, there's a change from sort of 3 linebackers to 2 as a base, sort of a base defense, but also what he's looking for the linebackers to do. We've talked about him, they're trying to spill and kill, as I believe the phrase you've used in the past. Explain, what that means and how that maybe makes the linebackers' responsibilities a little different this year.
Yeah, so it's sort of, I guess, a newer concept, I would probably say, in defense that you want to, it used to be that you wanted to force a running back inside and that each person had a defined gap. And that has sort of changed to now you want to make that guy run laterally, spill, and then kill, have people to clean up. And so a lot of times, again, this is about playing with gaps in the run game so that you can defend the pass. So, like, depending on the offensive action, like, a lot of times what the defensive line is going to try to do is come down inside and hold blockers. And so instead of, like, trying to get upfield and penetrate, they're going to try to control the line of scrimmage. That keeps the linebackers clean to then play the outside gap. So a lot of times, like, they'll just even line up outside, like in the C gaps. But, they also will flow outside. So so now instead of having, like your traditional Mike linebacker coming flying downhill in the B gap to plug that gap, now maybe the D end is going to squeeze inside of it and try to push the ball outside to the Mike.
So I think this has been generally a fairly optimistic tone that we have struck here on the show. Seems like there's reason to think this is going to be a better defense this year. But what to you right now? We're not quite halfway through fall camp. What to you right now is the biggest question mark on the defense? With just over 3 weeks to go before the season, what's the biggest question mark or concern for you on the defense?
Yeah, and I will say that I'm pretty bullish on Ohio State's defense because, they have a bunch of guys back. I mean, like, really, like, by most major program standards, it's an incredibly high amount of returning production on defense. And then you combine that together with, I almost feel somewhat bad for some of those players because I feel like they've been much maligned where no one would look good in some of the positions that they were being put in schematically last year. And so, when you combine that with Knowles, who I have a lot of respect for, I think you're going to see a pretty good product. In terms of question marks, I mean, I do think, I'm interested, I will say at a minimum, in terms of how he adapts to the Big Ten. I mean, I do think, like, the difference between the Big 12 and the Big Ten can be overstated. But because of their schedule, I do think that there are some distinctions. And, for instance, like, one thing that really jumped out at me that I'm supportive of as a concept is, like, instead of bringing in a Sam linebacker or a third linebacker, using someone like, you go from essentially like a continuum of nickels, right? So you have, like, Tanner McAllister, who's your cover nickel, essentially like a third corner. Then you can go to Latham Ranson, who's like a little bit more of like a safety, but as like Knowles said, can trigger. And then, like, you can go to Court Williams, who's like really sort of like almost a linebacker safety hybrid. And so, like, that keeps the same 4-2-5 framework in place and flexibility in the defense. But just like by changing personnel, you've really sort of changed that one role. But again, like, I think that, we'll have to see how that sort of all comes together. I do think there's some of these issues that are going to be ironed out as they progress and then like sort of test these ideas in action. But, I mean, I think in terms of they have lots of safeties, I think at this point that they feel confident in. So it makes sense to me. I think defensive line and safety are probably the strengths of the defense. And so, I think it'll be just sort of like, there'll be some learning on the fly with some of these things, but, they have, as I said, they have guys with experience, and, Knowles is such a significant step up that it should be, there should be reasons for optimism for Ohio State.
All right, I mean, we can put a number to that. I know last year's Ohio State defense felt like a total disaster to Buckeye fans. They did finish 20th in the SP Plus rankings in defense, 31st in F Plus from Football Outsiders. How confident are you, Ross, that they get to a top 5, maybe even just top 10 kind of defense by those metrics this season? And then how much of that optimism is based on personnel and how much is based on coaching changes? Because it sounds like both of them kind of factor in there.
Yeah, agreed. I think the SP Plus was definitely a bit more bullish than FEI was, which is like the other main advanced stat. But I looked before a show, and SP Plus has them projected to be 13th in defense this year. I don't see any reason that they can't be, maybe top 5's pushing it, but I see them in the 8 to 10 range. And again, it's almost hard to disentangle because you do have so much experience back. But even if all those guys were back, if they were doing the same scheme as last year, I probably wouldn't feel as confident about it. So, let's say, I'd probably say at least 65% Jim Knowles, and then it makes his job a lot easier, though, the fact that they have so much returning experience, particularly at some critical positions.
Yeah, one of the things with the preseason advanced metrics is they can't calculate the difference between a Terry Combs / Matt Barnes defense and a Jim Knowles defense. They're looking at the guys. So that's one thing that maybe is another reason for optimism there beyond what the preseason projections are. And the preseason projections are pretty rosy compared to last year. So, we all often remember the negative moments. I mean, people even do that with the Ohio State offense that was number 1 last year, which, you got stopped on that 1/3 and 1, but even in a scheme that was pretty deficient last year, like a lot of the guys they have returning had a lot of good moments, like a Steel Chambers who was just playing linebacker, like really solidified things. Ronnie Hickman had a lot of good moments, so they do have guys that even in some trying circumstances played pretty well last year. It's shaping up to be a pretty fun year. It feels like they've got the personnel. I'm super interested to see how different this defense really does look on the field when you get to see them with the bullets flying for real. Like you said, we saw a whole bunch of variety during the spring game, and that's generally a time when you're trying not to show anything. So what is it going to look like when they're playing a game for real in just over 3 weeks? That is going to be a lot of fun to find out. Hope you guys enjoyed that. Our shows with Ross always get great feedback. He does a great job sort of explaining it in ways that everyone can understand. Make you a little bit of a smarter football fan coming into the season. That can never be a bad thing. Ross is just one of our 3 scheme X's and O's guys at BuckeyeHuddle.com. We should have that beat really, really covered well this year. So make sure you check that out. It's BuckeyeHuddle.com. The full site is scheduled to launch very soon. We'll get you an official date as soon as we have it, but very soon. We appreciate your patience. In the meantime, make sure you're subscribed to all of our podcasts. Buckeye Weekly, Big Me Kickoff. Kevin Noon is going to be doing that one. And of course, Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning, which you're listening to right now. And then on YouTube, make sure you're subscribed to our new channel. If you're looking at a channel that says Ohio Preps, that is not the current channel. The best way to find it is just go to the board at BuckeyeHuddle.com and get a link there, or just check my Twitter, twitter.com/Tom Orr4, or Tony Gerdeman's Twitter, Kevin Noon's Twitter, Mark Givler's Twitter. Find anyone on site. We are tweeting out that link so you can get to the right channel. So you get all of our podcasts, pregame shows, postgame shows, live episodes, all that great stuff, all for free, all on YouTube at our new YouTube channel. Just hit those for the link, and you will get it all there in one spot. So that'll do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.